Alright guys, we're going to have a little quick look through how to set up and execute various barbell hip thrust variations. So first we'll start off with how to set up on the bench and also how to position your torso in order to get the most out of this movement. So we're going to get Emma to start off with where do we position our shoulders on the bench. Well, really we're going to take, if you think about your shoulder blades, we're going to go right to the bottom of the shoulder blades on what we call that scapular border, and that's where you're going to line up your upper back. Now, that should pretty much pivot around the edge of this bench here. At no point should we see the shoulders sliding down the bench, and we shouldn't see you like sliding up and across the bench. It should be very much a case that those shoulders stay in that same position throughout the movement. Next consideration, once we've got that in check, is we need to look at our lumbo-pelvic position. So it's the position of your rib cage relative to the pelvis. Now, we've talked about in many other videos this idea of locking in that can of stability. So what that's going to mean is that if we imagine Emma's going to kind of think about bringing her ribcage down to the pelvis, so she's bracing that anterior cord, those abdominals, and she's making sure that the bottom of that ribcage lines up with the line of her pelvis. So one of the common mistakes we'll often see is that the pelvis will drop down on its own and the ribcage stays up. So you'll see almost like this big drop off of the pelvis. And what that does is that puts the lower back in a very stressed position. So we want to make sure that when we're going throughout this movement, if Em comes to the top, full extension, as she comes down, she's going to think about bringing this all down as one section. So ribcage and pelvis come down together. And now you can see that that spine stays nice and neutral throughout the entirety of the movement. Last consideration when it comes to our setup is we have to consider where our feet. Now, the width of their stance is going to vary from individual to individual. It's going to depend on their structure, and it's also going to depend on potentially like what structural limitations you might have. So what we're going to look at with this is, if depending on if we're doing a full range movement or whether we're trying to make it glute bias, for the most part we are going to keep those shins pretty vertical throughout. So that means that the feet are not going to be too far away. So if you just take your feet, if our feet are too far away, chances are we start to leverage off those hamstrings a bit too much. If we bring the feet almost too far under us, as you can see, almost the heels or the ankles behind the knee joint, what you'll end up finding is you might start feeling a little bit too much quad or a big stretch in the quad. So as a good gauge, we generally want the ankles exactly directly under the knees, and we want to try and maintain that vertical shin angle for the most part throughout, unless we're doing an American style hip thrust where you touch the floor every time. So if you go all the way down, there's going to be a little bit of a travel back, but we accept that that's part of that movement. If, however, we wanted to do a bit more of a glute intent or glute biased, we would want to make sure that the shins stay vertical throughout. So keep your feet this way for me. Keep going, keep going, keep going. There we go. And as she gets through that top position, as she lowers down, the shins are going to stay vertical throughout the entire movement, which means that our range here is going to be a little bit shorter than if we were to do the full movement. But what that means now is that Emma's going to be able to keep the tension directed on those glutes throughout the entirety of the movement. So do 1 or 2 reps and slowly down. Just as you reach that point where the shins might want to start traveling back, would be this part where you would finish the descent of the movement. Great. And take it on. Now, last consideration as well is that you'll be prescribed tempos depending on what your training plan is giving us, and a lot of that is going to be based on what we're trying to get out of the movement. Now, if we're doing more of a glute bias bridge, we might find that both the upward part of the movement and the downward part of the movement are going to be very considered and very controlled. So you can see that there's no jerking or pushing out of those end ranges. It's very controlled movements and very controlled transitions. However, if we did want Em to do, say, like for example, an American style hip thrust where she's doing the full movement, we might say, well, actually we want you to explode up into that top position and 3 seconds down, explode up. And that might be something that we program, but there's going to be a particular reason for that. So this is just the basic setup and execution considerations for your barbell hip thrust variations.